You're welcome on Network Africa.
Thank you.
Now, recent happenings in Ghana brings us to a point where we need to review the election that brought you to power. How do you see that election?
I think that election has been like any other we've held. It's been transparent, free, and fair. And we have, at every election, allowed observers to come and take a look. We ourselves have had a coalition of domestic observers who always write a report. And so nothing has flashed out that was extraordinary about this particular election. And so I think it was a normal election like we've had, successful. And indeed, it would have gone down in history as the most transparent, free, and fair, because absolutely no violence, but at the end of it pops up a dispute. But it's been like all other elections, transparent, free, and fair.
Taking a look at some of the reactions that trailed your emergence to power, many believe that you rode on the crest of sympathetic votes, talking about the late John Mills.
I do think that many factors go into an election, and there's no one factor that makes one win an election. You can ride on the highest sympathy. If you don't have the personality to win an election, you won't win it. And so there are different factors that go into an election. I leave it for historians to judge what went into this election. I think that's for posterity to judge.
Yeah. Still on the last election that brought you to power, many saw a determined attempt by the Ghanaian voters. As a matter of fact, we have a voters turnout of 80%. We saw both the old, the young, the sick, the disabled all came out en masse in a determined effort to make their votes count. But how would you respond to this novelty of the biometric data system in defining democracy in Ghana?
If you look at the turnout, it is not too different from previous elections. Ghanaians have always had a very high interest in deciding who lead them. And so the turnout always exceeds about 70%. And this election was no different from the others. Every 4 years, Ghanaians want to take a part in who become their leaders over the next 4 years. And so if you look at the average turnout for the election, compared with other elections, there wasn't much difference. But certainly everybody, went to the election. We were trying biometric registration for the first time. And so Ghana has been a pioneer with maintaining integrity of elections. And so we were adding a new feature to improve the integrity of our elections by registering everybody biometrically. And when we had done that, we produced a register, which was a biometric register. But then there was an insistence that there should be a verification process. So there was nothing wrong with the biometric register. It was fine. It was clean. Everybody had his registration details captured. But then there was an insistence that there should be a verification process. And so after you had registered biometrically, before you could vote, you had to go through a biometric verification process. And because it was being introduced for the first time, there were glitches, But I do think that the election went fairly well, despite the glitches. The Electoral Commission conducted itself well, and the whole, decision was made.
Now, let's look at the process of transparency in the election. At the point we got to a place, because I was also an observer and also a pressman from Channels TV, we got to a place and we were made to understand that it was an IT firm recruited to transmit data from the polling centers to the Electoral Commission, and it was held behind closed doors. And as a matter of fact, the opposition party caused a lot of uproar there until we got in there. So how would you explain that particular flashpoint?
Well, I'm not the Electoral Commission, so I cannot explain that. The Electoral Commission is an independent agency in Ghana. It makes its own arrangements. And so if it made an arrangement with an IT firm, it was the business of the Electoral Commission. But it is instructive that the issue with the IT firm is not a subject of the minorities litigation in the court. If they thought there was a serious problem, they would have added it in the affidavit. As far as I know, that issue that occurred during the election is not a part of the current litigation between the Supreme Court. So I think it's not an issue to discuss.
So how would you react to the allegation of underage voters in some regions in the elections?
I don't know about underage voting. The registration process is what captures the eligible voters. And all parties have their agents at the various electoral centers, polling stations. And if you think that somebody is underage, you're supposed to fill a challenge form. And so if you fill the challenge form, the Electoral Commission will hold hearings and find out if the person was actually underage or not eligible to vote. And so if you didn't fill challenge forms, and you come back later and say underage people voted, I don't know on what basis. It might be anecdotal. But Ghana's electoral system gives you opportunities at every step of the way to mount a challenge. And so if you don't mount that challenge, you cannot come back later and claim you can't come back and claim that something happened when you did not exercise your civic responsibility.
Now, taking account of stewardship now, on your recent statement, it's quite surprising to many people that you said that the recent petition process in Ghana shouldn't be a distraction to your government.
Absolutely not. It shouldn't. I think that elections were declared and I was properly inaugurated into office. I'm doing my job according to the Constitution, and it's properly before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will make a determination of it. And so why should we be distracted by the Supreme Court case? We should go ahead. I've been doing what I have to do, forming a government, putting policy in place. I've passed my budget, and I think that the governance of the country is going forward. I'm here attending the AU summit, and I'm going to France on an official visit. After that, I'm going to Japan to negotiate the resumption of the yen loan portfolio from Japan to finance infrastructure projects in Ghana. And so we should continue. The Supreme Court will make its determination at the appropriate time.
Yeah, just another novelty we observed during the inauguration now was the overnight swearing in of the Speaker of the Parliament. Would you describe this as a democratic culture?
It came from experience. What happens is the term of the Parliament expires at midnight on the 6th of January. And then the inauguration of the President takes place on the 7th. Now, before we used to, in the morning, convene Parliament and do the election of the Speaker. And so people had complained that there was a certain vacuum of authority between midnight of 6th January and when the Speaker was sworn in and when the President was eventually sworn in. And so to take care of that lacuna, Parliament decided that as the life of that Parliament ended, the new Parliament will be sworn in at midnight. And then the election of the Speaker and everything takes place, and then the President is sworn in at the usual time. And so it takes care of that vacuum that existed. And I think they went through the Constitution. The Constitution allows it. So I think we keep improving as we go along, and that was an improvement.
Now, you've been close to 5 months in office. What's been the experience?
It's been turbulent, but we're riding the storm. Often, after almost every election, a new government that comes in has a bit of a honeymoon, and you're giving time to form your government and all that. This government hasn't had any honeymoon. We've been through a lot of turbulence. We had an energy crisis that had occurred as a result of the disruption of the West African gas pipeline in August last year, and we had been managing it, hoping that the pipeline will come back into operation by the end of the year. It didn't, and crude oil prices started to go up, and so the price of light crude went up. We had to turn all our thermal generation back to light crude, which is 3 times more expensive than the gas prices. And so it created a problem for us in respect of the utilities recouping the investments they were making in terms of providing energy especially. And so that has occupied me for the last several months, how to resolve the energy crisis, because we have an economy that is growing at 8% average per year, and so there's a huge demand for energy. And so when you have a load shedding crisis where businesses cannot have sufficient power and they have to resort to generators using diesel, then it means it drives up their cost of production. And so that has occupied my attention for the last 5 months. And happily, we're getting on top of it. We had to fast-track various projects that we had on stream and bring them on earlier than we had anticipated. We had been working on the T3 thermal plant. We've managed to take it over, and it's producing at 130 megawatts. We were working on the Bui hydro project, and it was supposed to be commissioned in November this year, but we've staged the commissioning. As soon as the first turbine was ready, we've put it into service. A second turbine is ready by July, another 130 megawatts. We're going to put it into service, and then we'll commission the final turbine in November. So we're doing things to fast-track more energy into the system, and we're hoping that the West African gas pipeline will come back on stream so that we can produce at an optimum to feed the energy demand, that the expansion of the economy is creating.
Now, you talked about the poverty in Ghana and the economy of Ghana with an annual average growth rate of 7.5%. But this reality has not translated to the lives of an average Ghanaian still living in poverty. I mean, poverty is still a big factor in Ghana. Any plans to change this fortune?
That is the challenge of governments in Africa. We're seeing rates of growth that are quite phenomenal, at least for 10 African countries. They're seeing rates of growth that range between 6 and 9%. Now, the challenge for us in government is how to translate that growth into jobs and to translate that growth into reducing poverty and improving the lives of our people. And so, while our economy is growing at an average of 8%, we need to see how we can translate that 8%. The market won't do it for you. And so government must put in social intervention programs that ensure that social safety nets are created for the people. So one of the first steps we've taken is to create a new Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection to bring all the social intervention programs together and make sure that the social safety nets that we are introducing are targeting the correct segment of people. Before that, we had social safety nets in all the ministries, and there was no coordination, no monitoring, no evaluation. And so we brought all that under one ministry. And so it targets the poorest of the poor in Ghana and see what, interventions they are receiving. We have a school feeding program. The poorest households in the country, are their children benefiting from the school feeding program? That's one of the things we want to know. We have a livelihood empowerment against poverty program that does direct cash transfers to poor households.
Are you sometimes worried that Ghana could fall into the serial mistakes of other African countries that have discovered oil but are yet to make the best use of it?
Let me say for two main reasons. One, because we've been able to learn the examples of other countries. Ghana has found oil at a time when you have the experiences of our brothers in Nigeria, and they've been very generous in sharing their experience with us. We've held several seminars in which experts from Nigeria have come to speak, and they've been very transparent about the mistakes that Nigeria made and how they're correcting those mistakes. And so, as a lesson to us, we cannot fall into the same trap if we learn the lesson that we have got well. We've also learned from countries like Norway that are touted as, having handled this resource the best. And it's helped us to put in the legislation in a more transparent manner that can ensure that this resource becomes a blessing to us. So one, because of the experiences we've had to learn, I don't think that we'll fall into the same pitfall. Aside from that, the next major issue is that when you have a resource like oil, if you have it at a time when you've developed democratic institutions and transparency and a vibrant media that is quick to raise the red flag, and civil society organizations and everybody that is watching how that resource is managed, there's no way you can fall into that same trap. And we have civil society organizations, we have media that are scrutinizing every single cent of this resource, and if there's something going wrong, they'll raise the red flag long before you're able to fall into a case.
So in terms of the oil factor now, what's the level of collaboration between Nigeria and Ghana?
In the period when we're preparing our legislation for Parliament in respect of the oil and gas industry, we held a lot of seminars. And the Nigerian government was very helpful. The Nigerian private sector was very helpful. A lot of resource people came from Nigeria. And so that collaboration exists. Even today, as we are a young oil producer, and we're nowhere near Nigeria, we're producing 110,000 barrels a day, but Nigeria has always stood by us. And I think that history brings our two countries together in a way that we are destined to work together. Nigeria has the most populous population in West Africa, huge market that is very attractive. And I think that Nigeria's population and its role in West Africa gives it a certain leadership that it must take onto itself to drive the whole of the sub-region along. It happens in almost every region. You have a driver. I mean, in Asia, Japan was a driver and helped move the whole of the the Far East, Southeast Asian economies along. In West Africa, I believe that Nigeria has that potential to drive the whole of the West African sub-region along. And so sometimes we have problems with the fact that Nigeria closes its market to everybody, including the sub-region. We cannot export textiles made into Ghana into Nigeria. There are several commodities we cannot export to Nigeria, which is the biggest market. Nigeria has nothing to fear from Ghana. Ghana is a small economy. Nigeria's economy, in comparison with Ghana's economy, is far larger. And so I think that if Nigeria takes its leadership role and moves the integration project, it will be to the benefit of the whole sub-region. I've been talking to my brother Jonathan about it. We've been engaging.
Now, talking about opening the economy now, that takes us to what happened last year, where there was a serious clampdown on Nigerian traders on medium-scale basis in Ghana, slamming them with a very huge capital base to start off their business. That does not seem to be in line with economic integration that African leaders are talking about.
It's something to do with the regulations that we have in Ghana about there are various things involved in that. It has to do with investment. It restricts a market to indigenous people. And so it says that to be able to sell in a market, you must be a Ghanaian citizen. It does not allow other people, to sell in a market. So one of the questions that came up is, what is a market? If a group of people go and sit somewhere and start selling, and it becomes a place where people go and buy, is it a market? So we are looking at all that legislation. It's from several decades back, and so we have a new, what we call Ghana Investment Promotion Center Act, which will be the replacer act for the previous one, to try and cater for those misdescriptions and other issues. In which areas do Ghanaians have the sole prerogative to do business? In which areas do other people have the prerogative? What are the qualifications for doing that and all that? And I think that if that new legislation passes, it will make things clearer than they have been in the past.
Mr. President, you really come across as a president with a strong view on educational policy. As a matter of fact, this contrasting views was played up during the election. You seem to have favored qualitative education as opposed to free education. Considering a polity like Ghana that a lot of people still may not have the privilege of enjoying such qualitative education, how would you justify such a policy of being against your opposition, John Nana Adokufo, who was a proponent of free education? How feasible is qualitative education in a situation like Ghana?
I think that it was an issue of common sense and logic. We have in our constitution provisions for universal access to free compulsory basic education. And so we have what we call the FQ, Free Compulsory Universal Basic Education. And it says that every Ghanaian must be guaranteed the right to free education up to the basic level. The basic level ends at the junior secondary school. We've been implementing it for nearly 10 years now. And we have major issues of quality at that level. the level at which Ghanaians are guaranteed free compulsory universal basic education has major issues of quality and access. We haven't resolved that. We said that if we have extra money to spend in secondary education, then we're better off spending it in improving access at the secondary level, but using any extra money to improve quality at the basic level. And so that is a major difference. I think that, the election took place and we won, and so quality won over free. Everybody likes free things. Indeed, if we had the resources, we should guarantee free education to our students from primary school right up to university. But the point is, you must invest logically in the segment that makes the best sense at any one time.
A lot of people are really interested in what Ghana's foreign policy would be in the next 4 years if we were to light up the crystal ball.
Ghana is on the roll, and we need to guide that role so that it makes the best benefit for our people. The problem with growth is that if it is not directed, then what would happen is you have a growing inequity or inequality between the richest people and the poorest people. And I think that what makes sustainable growth is that everybody is able to move forward together. And so we must create a situation where the fruits of growth are distributed equitably down the class line so that everybody feels a part of that growth. Otherwise, then you have social problems. You have people for whom life is not worth living, and he doesn't mind taking you out who has your Benzes and all your properties, in an armed robbery or something. And so it's in the interest of the richest people to ensure that people have the basic common existence to be able to survive. And that's why we must rechannel a lot of that growth into social programs, affordable housing, into urban renewal, and all the other programs that make everybody feel a part of the prosperity that they are seeing around them. You can judge the prosperity of a country by the latest cars you're seeing. And if you go to Accra, you see some of the latest cars on the road. But what is the life of the common person? If you're driving a Bentley and somebody cannot afford the basics, he one day come and rob you and, kill you. And so let's let everybody grow together. Maybe you don't have a Bentley. Have a Mercedes-Benz. It's cheaper than a Bentley. And let's move part of that fruit of growth to the common person so that one, their children are able to have an education. Two, they're able to feed themselves. Three, they have a decent accommodation to be able to live. That is the commitment that African countries should have.
Now, before we end this interview now, on a lighter note now, there are so many factors that we just look at now. The internal challenges of the National Democratic Convention as the ruling party in Ghana. And also, we look at someone like former President Rawlings with very strong reservations now. And in spite of all these challenges, you've managed to weather the storm. And connecting with the voices on the streets now, during the election, there was a very wide talk about the President, Dr. John Dramani Mahama, being very charming. Did you play up the charming factor?
I don't know. You should be asking the electorate this question. I'm not used to marking myself. For me, what you see is what you get. I am who I am. I've been in politics since 1996. I've occupied different positions from deputy minister to member of parliament to minister to vice president to president. What you see is what you get.
Dr. John Dramani Mahama, it's been a wonderful moment having you in this edition of Network Africa. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.